Under the dim light of an autumn evening, where the streets smelled faintly of rain and fallen leaves, she walked slowly, her steps unhurried, as if time itself belonged to her. Eleanor was not the kind of girl who turned heads in crowded rooms. Her beauty was not loud, but quiet, the sort that lingered in memory long after a glance. She carried an air of stillness, a kind of tender patience that came from years of learning to endure life's burdens without complaint. Her mother used to say she was born with a soft light inside her, a glow that could heal wounded hearts, though Eleanor herself never believed such words. And yet, whenever she smiled, the world seemed less harsh, and even the broken pieces of the day felt as if they might fit together again. The city was alive that evening, its heart beating with neon lights, laughter spilling out from cafes, and the hum of passing cars. But within Elena's chest there was a quiet ache. She had spent the day working tirelessly, moving between tasks at a small bookstore where she often lost herself among pages that were not her own. Books had always been her sanctuary, her little healing refuge where sorrow turned into stories and pain into poetry. But as much as she loved the shelves filled with paper and ink, she could not deny the truth that life was heavier than fiction. Debt pressed against her family, memories of her father's illness shadowed her thoughts, and loneliness often wrapped itself around her shoulders like an unwelcome shawl. And yet, as she crossed the square that night, something inside her whispered that change was near. The breeze carried a gentleness unusual for late September, brushing against her cheek with almost human tenderness. She paused for a moment near the fountain, watching the water arc gracefully into the air before falling back into its basin, like time folding into itself. There, beneath the golden glow of the street lamps, fate waited for her in the form of a man whose world was so far from hers that destiny itself seemed to laugh at the audacity of their meeting. He was standing apart from the crowd, a tall figure dressed impeccably in dark shades of charcoal and midnight. Harrison Cole, a name she had heard before, whispered on news reports, printed on the covers of financial magazines, spoken with both envy and disdain. He was the man who had everything, wealth, power, influence, yet carried an expression of someone who had never truly been seen. His eyes, though sharp, seemed tired, as though the weight of empires had long pressed down on his shoulders. He looked like a fortress, tall, unyielding, carved from stone. And yet, when Eleanor's gaze met his across the square, she saw a fracture in the walls, a glimpse of the man behind the mask. Their eyes lingered. Just a second, perhaps two, but in that suspended moment, the noise of the city seemed to fall silent. It was as if two different worlds, hers of quiet endurance and his of thunderous command, recognized each other with an unspoken question. What would happen if we allowed the distance to close? Eleanor's heart fluttered unexpectedly, a fragile wing beat inside her chest. She quickly turned away, chastising herself for indulging in such a thought. What business did a girl like her have even imagining a life intersecting with a man like him? He belonged to skyscrapers and courtrooms, while she belonged to narrow alleys lined with bookstores and second-hand dreams. But destiny has its own rhythm, and it does not ask permission. As Elena began to walk away, her worn leather bag slipped from her shoulder, spilling its contents onto the pavement. Scattered books, a half-finished journal, and a faded photograph of her family. Before she could kneel to gather them, a shadow moved closer, and she looked up to see Harrison bending down, his hand reaching for the photograph first. For a man who had signed contracts worth billions, his movements were strangely careful, almost reverent, as he lifted the fragile picture and studied it for a second longer than politeness required. "You dropped this," he said, his voice low, rich, carrying both command and weariness. He extended the photograph to her, and for the briefest instant their fingers brushed. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her, as if the simple touch carried healing she hadn't known she needed. She looked at him, and the world seemed impossibly quiet once again. "Thank you," she replied softly, her voice almost hesitant. He could have walked away. He could have left her kneeling on the cold stone ground, gathering books into her arms, disappearing back into the faceless crowd of his life. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way her eyes, though filled with fatigue, still held light, or the way she clutched her books as though they were lifelines. Whatever it was, he remained. "You like to read," he remarked, glancing at the titles she hastily stacked. Stories of resilience, novels about hope, poetry about longing. His tone was not mocking, but curious, as though this discovery surprised him. "I work in a bookstore," Eleanor explained, pushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Sometimes I forget the world outside when I'm surrounded by stories." He gave a small smile, faint, almost imperceptible, but it softened the hard lines of his face. "Stories," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Perhaps that's what the world needs more of." There was something in the way he said it that made her pause. It was not a businessman's casual remark, but a confession from someone who understood emptiness, someone who might secretly long for healing the way she did. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor did not feel invisible. And for the first time in even longer, Harrison felt as though he was more than a title, more than the shadow of power people feared or envied. In that quiet square, beneath the glow of the lamps and the whispers of the fountain, two souls brushed against each other. Not with fireworks, but with the gentleness of a dawn light spilling into a darkened room. Neither of them knew it yet, but this encounter was the first stone laid in the foundation of something larger than either could imagine. It would be a journey not just of romance, but of healing. Two wounded lives daring to believe that love could be more than survival, that it could be sanctuary, that it could be the very force to stitch together what the world had broken. And as Harrison finally spoke again, offering to carry some of her books as they walked, Eleanor felt the strangest, sweetest certainty. Life, which had always seemed like a battle she fought alone, was quietly opening its arms to her. She didn't know what waited ahead, joy or sorrow, laughter or tears, but she knew one thing with the clarity of a prayer whispered in silence: the story had already begun. The following days unfolded like threads, weaving themselves into a tapestry neither of them could have imagined. Eleanor returned to her bookstore as usual, the familiar scent of old paper and polished wood greeting her each morning. Yet something within her had shifted, something small but undeniable. She caught herself glancing at the door more often, wondering if the man from the square, this enigmatic figure who had bent down to gather her scattered books, would ever appear again. She scolded herself for the thought, but it lingered, warm as the morning sunlight spilling through the dusty windows. Harrison, on his side of the city, found himself equally unsettled. For years he had lived in a world built on numbers, contracts, and the kind of sharp decisions that carved out empires but left scars upon the soul. People approached him either in fear or in calculation, rarely in genuine warmth. But the girl from the square had looked at him without agenda, without trembling awe, without bitterness. She had thanked him with eyes that seemed to carry healing light, as though in her presence he was not a fortress of steel, but a man, simply, vulnerably human. That realization lingered, quiet and insistent, beneath the noise of board meetings and the constant war of business. Their second meeting was not by chance. Harrison had made sure of it, though he convinced himself it was coincidence. He had sent an assistant to discreetly inquire about the little bookstore near the square. One late afternoon, as twilight painted the sky with hues of lavender and gold, he stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly, and Eleanor, who had been arranging books on the front display, looked up in surprise. For a moment, neither spoke. The store was empty except for them, and the silence between their breaths seemed louder than the turning of any page. Harrison broke it first. "I thought perhaps you could recommend something," he said, his voice gentle, though beneath it lay a current of nerves he hadn't felt in years. Eleanor smiled, and it was like a window opening in a room long closed. "That depends," she replied, brushing a bit of dust from her hands. "Do you want a story that challenges you, or one that heals?" The word lingered between them. Heals. Harrison felt it strike something deep, something long ignored. He cleared his throat. "Healing," he admitted softly, surprising even himself. "I think I could use that." She led him to the shelves, her fingers trailing along the spines of books, as though each carried a secret pulse. She handed him a novel about forgiveness and resilience, a tale where broken people found wholeness not by denying their pain, but by walking through it together. As she spoke of the story, her voice carried that same warmth he had felt when she first thanked him, a warmth that seemed to mend cracks he had forgotten were there. Their conversation stretched long after the choice of book had been made. He asked about her life, though she revealed little, careful to keep her struggles shielded, and she asked about his, though he offered only fragments, softened versions of truth. Yet even in fragments they found connection. It was not the glittering romance of sweeping gestures and dramatic confessions, but something more delicate, more enduring. It was the slow weaving of trust, a fragile thread that shimmered in the dim light of the bookstore. As days turned into weeks, Harrison returned more often. Sometimes he purchased books, though it was clear he came less for the stories on paper and more for the one quietly forming between them. Eleanor began to anticipate the sound of the bell above the door, her heart skipping at each chime. She found herself laughing more, her burdens momentarily lighter when he was near. He, in turn, discovered something he hadn't known he had lost. The simple joy of conversation without pretense, the quiet healing of sitting across from someone who asked for nothing but presence. One evening, as rain pattered against the windows, the electricity flickered and then went out entirely. The bookstore fell into darkness, broken only by the glow of candles Elena quickly lit. Harrison had been there that night, thumbing through a collection of poetry he pretended to read. As the shadows danced across the walls, Eleanor smiled, shaking her head. "It seems even the city wants us to slow down." They sat together at a small wooden table, a candle flickering between them. The rain outside was steady, soothing, like a lullaby. Eleanor read aloud from the poetry book, her voice soft and healing. Harrison listened, not to the words themselves, but to the way her voice wrapped around them, turning ordinary lines into something sacred. For the first time in years, he felt safe in silence, safe in the company of another soul. "Do you ever wonder," she asked suddenly, setting the book down. "Why people come into our lives when they do, as if the universe waits for the exact moment when we need them most." Harrison studied her, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes. "Every day," he admitted, his voice low, almost raw. "But I've never had the courage to believe it." Eleanor reached across the table, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand. "Maybe it's time you did." That touch, gentle, tentative, healing, was the bond being forged. It was not passion in its loudest form, but a quiet vow, whispered in the language of hearts learning to trust. And in that moment, something shifted irrevocably. Harrison, the man who had built his life on walls and fortresses, allowed himself to lower the gates. Eleanor, the girl who had lived too long in shadows, let herself step into the light of another. But as with all fragile beginnings, the world outside did not pause to let them linger forever in that gentle glow. Whispers began, of who Harrison was, of the empire he carried, of the dangers that lurked behind his wealth and reputation. Elena, though she had never sought anything more than honesty and warmth, found herself standing at the edge of a life far greater and far more perilous than she had ever imagined. Still, on nights when fear pressed against her, she remembered the healing weight of his gaze, the softness of his hand against hers, and the truth they had begun to build in the quiet corners of a bookstore lit by candlelight. Love, after all, is not forged in comfort, but in the storms that test whether two souls can weather them together. And theirs, though only beginning, already carried the promise of endurance. The weeks that followed unfurled like petals of a flower hesitant to bloom. Elena found herself living two lives, the one everyone else saw, where she remained the quiet girl working in the bookstore, and the one hidden deep in her heart, where each moment with Harrison lingered like a secret melody. She had not asked for him to enter her world, and yet now that he had, the very air seemed gentler, the colors of her days more vivid, as though the universe itself had brushed her life with healing tones of light. Harrison, for his part, was unaccustomed to such simplicity. His days were still filled with meetings, deadlines, and the constant battle of maintaining an empire that others were waiting to tear apart. But at night, when the boardroom emptied and the city lights glimmered far below his high office windows, he thought of her. He thought of her laughter when she accidentally spilled tea on an old poetry book and tried to dry the pages with the gentlest care. He thought of her questions, small, human questions no one had asked him in years. Did you sleep well? What was the last story that moved you? Do you ever miss the boy you were before the world demanded so much? Each question pierced through layers of armor, revealing a softness he had thought forever lost. Their connection grew not through grand declarations, but through the quiet rhythm of shared presence. One evening, Harrison invited Elena to walk with him through the botanical gardens that stretched quietly at the edge of the city. The gardens were nearly empty, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the faint hum of crickets. Lanterns glowed along the stone paths, their light painting everything in shades of gold. Eleanor marveled at the roses blooming late in the season, while Harrison found himself marveling at her, the way her fingers brushed petals with reverence, as if even flowers could sense her healing touch. "You know," he said quietly as they paused by a fountain, "I've built skyscrapers, negotiated contracts worth more than I can count, but I don't think I've ever noticed a rose until now." Elena turned, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Perhaps you were always too busy building walls," she whispered, "to notice what was growing just beyond them." The words struck him with gentle truth. He reached for her hand, almost uncertain, and when her fingers settled into his, the world seemed to exhale. Their silence was not empty. It was filled with a tender music that needed no translation. Days stretched into small rituals. He would stop by the bookstore, sometimes buying books he never intended to read, sometimes only to sit across from her during her lunch break with 2 cups of coffee between them. She, in turn, began to understand the man behind the name. He was not only the fortress the world saw, but a man who carried hidden scars, loneliness, betrayals, the exhaustion of being needed by everyone, but understood by no one. In Elena's presence, those scars no longer defined him. They simply existed, softened by her acceptance, wrapped in a healing quiet that gave him space to breathe. One evening, after a particularly difficult day in court, where his company had been challenged yet again, Harrison arrived at the bookstore long after closing. He stood by the glass door, unsure if he should knock. Inside, he saw Elena sweeping, her hair falling loose across her shoulders, her movements unhurried. She looked up, saw him there, and without hesitation unlocked the door. "You look tired," she said softly. "I am," he admitted. And then, as though he could no longer carry the weight of his armor, he simply asked, "May I just sit here? No words, no explanations. Just here." She nodded and guided him to a chair, lighting a single candle on the table beside him. He sat, shoulders heavy, while she busied herself with closing chores. She didn't demand his story, didn't press him to explain. She only hummed a soft tune, one her mother used to sing to her as a child, a tune woven with healing gentleness. And for Harrison, that was enough. He realized then that sometimes the greatest gift was not advice or solutions, but the quiet presence of someone who allowed him to simply be. Their bond deepened in these moments of unspoken care. Elena, who had always lived with burdens of her own, felt her heart healing as she witnessed his vulnerability. Harrison, who had always stood alone, felt for the first time that he was no longer abandoned in his battles, and slowly the invisible line that separated their worlds, his of wealth and hers of simplicity, began to blur. One night, as winter's first snow began to fall, Harrison invited her to his home. She hesitated, aware of the chasm between their lives, but curiosity and the quiet trust they had built drew her forward. His house was not just a mansion. It was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the city. Yet, despite its grandeur, it felt strangely empty, as though no laughter had ever lived within its walls. He watched her as she walked through the grand hallway, her gaze resting not on the luxury but on the small details, a faded photograph on the mantel, a worn leather chair by the window. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "but it feels lonely." Harrison's throat tightened. "It has been," he confessed. Eleanor turned to him then, her eyes filled with a tenderness that seemed to pierce through every layer he had ever built. She reached out, brushing her fingers against his hand, and whispered, "Then let's not let it be lonely any more." That night they sat together by the fireplace, speaking not of business or the world outside, but of childhood dreams, forgotten joys, and the small miracles that had shaped them. He told her of the first book he ever loved, a gift from his mother long before wealth defined his worth. She told him of her father's laughter, how it had once filled their small home with warmth before illness dimmed it. Their stories intertwined like threads, binding them in ways words alone could never capture. When the fire dimmed and the snow outside thickened, Harrison found himself leaning closer, his hand brushing against her cheek. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice trembling with both fear and longing. "I don't know where this will lead. I only know that when I'm with you, I feel something I thought I had lost forever. Peace." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "Then let's not worry about where it leads," she murmured. "Let's just be here. Sometimes healing begins not with answers, but with presence." And so their connection, fragile yet undeniable, deepened further. They were no longer strangers bound by chance, but two souls walking side by side into a future neither fully understood, but both were willing to risk. It was the rising of something beautiful, tender and rare, a love that did not demand perfection, but offered sanctuary. Outside, the snow fell silently, covering the city in a blanket of white. Inside, two hearts, long burdened by solitude, discovered the quiet joy of belonging. And though challenges loomed unseen beyond that night, for now they allowed themselves this, a fragile, healing truth whispered in the stillness, that love in its gentlest form had already begun to heal them both. Winter did not remain gentle for long. Snow that had once fallen softly now became storms that pressed against the windows of Harrison's world, and in the silence between their evenings together the shadows of reality crept in. Love, tender and healing as it was, never arrives without trials, and theirs was no exception. The very bond that had blossomed in quiet bookstores and firelit rooms began to draw the eyes of others, eyes sharpened by envy, judgment, and malice. Eleanor first noticed it in the whispers. At the bookstore, customers she had known for years exchanged knowing glances when Harrison stopped by. Some murmured her name with disapproval, as though she had overstepped her station by even speaking to a man like him. At night, when she walked home, the weight of those stares lingered, heavy as frost on her shoulders. She had lived her life quietly, asking little of the world, and now the world seemed determined to question her worth simply because she had dared to love. Harrison saw it too. In meetings, colleagues dropped subtle remarks, their voices coated with false amusement, but edged with suspicion. "The girl from the bookstore," one executive had chuckled. "Seems you've found yourself a charming distraction." He did not answer, though the muscles in his jaw tightened. For all his power, Harrison knew that the same empire he had built could quickly turn cruel. In his world, love was currency, and those who loved without calculation were seen as weak. Yet Harrison did not see weakness in Eleanor. He saw the quiet strength that had held her family together, the healing gentleness that had begun to mend his own fractured soul. But whispers are not the greatest threat. Misunderstandings are, and it was one such misunderstanding that tested the fragile bond they had built. One evening, Harrison had promised to meet Eleanor at the gardens, where they first held hands. She waited beneath the lanterns, her breath visible in the cold night air, a book clasped in her hands. Time slipped by, minutes, then hours, each moment stretched with the ache of disappointment. He never came. When she returned home, her heart heavy, she found no message, no explanation, only silence. What Elena did not know was that Harrison had been summoned unexpectedly to a gathering of investors, men ruthless in both business and gossip. There, one of them had deliberately placed photographs on the table, pictures of Elena at the bookstore speaking to a young man who had been asking about a rare book. The angle of the camera turned the harmless conversation into something suggestive, as if to imply betrayal. "You should be careful, Harrison," one man said smoothly. "Not every smile is as innocent as it seems." Though Harrison knew the cruelty of manipulation, the images planted a seed of doubt he despised himself for feeling. He left the gathering consumed not by anger at Elena, but by fury at his own heart for wavering in trust. And yet, instead of going to her, he drowned himself in silence, unsure how to bridge the sudden storm between them. Elena, sensing his distance, withdrew into herself. She returned to her books, her journals, her quiet routines, but even the healing refuge of words could not erase the ache. She wondered if she had been foolish, believing that someone like her could step into a world like his without being shattered by it. Nights grew longer, and loneliness returned to curl around her like a shadow. She thought she had escaped. When they finally met again, the air between them was heavy with unspoken hurt. They sat together in the bookstore after hours, a candle flickering between them, just as it had the night the power failed weeks before. But this time the silence was not soothing. It was brittle, sharp, filled with the weight of doubts neither wished to confess. "Why didn't you come?" Eleanor asked at last, her voice steady, though her hands trembled against the table. Harrison's gaze dropped, his fingers tightening around the edge of his chair. "I was kept away. There were things said, things shown to me." Her heart tightened. "Pictures?" she whispered. She had heard the rumors, felt the stares, but hearing it from his lips cut deeper than she expected. "Yes," he admitted, shame darkening his features. "And for a moment I let them take root. I should have come to you, but instead I stayed silent. That silence is mine to own." The pain in her chest was sharp, yet beneath it lay something softer. She saw the struggle in him, the battle between a man raised in suspicion and the man who wanted to believe in love's healing truth. She reached across the table, her hand hovering before resting lightly on his. "You are not the only one afraid, Harrison. I have asked myself every night if I am enough for your world. And yet, here we are, two people afraid, but still here." Her words broke something open in him. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers, his voice trembling. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I cannot lose you, Eleanor. Not now. Not after finding what I didn't even know I needed." She closed her eyes, breathing in the warmth of his closeness. "Then don't lose me. Hold me, and hold to the truth we've built. Let the world whisper. Let them doubt. We know what lives here, between us." He pulled her into his arms, and for a long moment they simply held each other, the healing silence returning, but this time not brittle. This time it was strong, forged by the trial they had survived. The storm had not broken them. It had shown them what they were willing to fight for. From then on, they moved with more courage. Elena no longer bowed under the weight of gossip. She carried herself with quiet dignity, knowing love was worth the trial. Harrison no longer allowed whispers to poison his trust. He became fiercely protective, not just of her, but of the truth of what they shared. They learned that love is not tested in moments of laughter, but in moments of doubt, when choosing each other requires faith stronger than fear. And so their story pressed forward. Two souls who had been scarred, finding in each other a love not free of storms, but one that carried within it the healing promise of shelter. Spring arrived with the quiet grace of a hymn, washing away the cold shadows of winter and leaving behind tender blossoms of hope. For Eleanor and Harrison, the storms they had endured no longer felt like wounds, but like milestones, markers of how far they had travelled together. Their love had been tested by silence, by whispers, by the cruel gaze of a world that doubted them. And yet, standing side by side beneath cherry trees in full bloom, they knew they had not only survived, they had grown stronger. The gardens where they had once walked as strangers became a sanctuary of healing. They returned often, strolling down familiar paths, pausing to watch petals fall into the fountains, speaking of dreams without fear. Harrison no longer spoke with the guarded tone of a man used to being betrayed. Instead, his words carried warmth, the kind of warmth that only blooms when trust has been rebuilt. Eleanor, who once feared she was unworthy of his world, now walked with quiet confidence, knowing she was not defined by wealth or status, but by the love they had nurtured together. Their connection deepened into a rhythm that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Harrison began spending evenings at the bookstore, sometimes helping Elena close shop, sometimes simply sitting in the quiet while she read aloud. In return, Eleanor brought life into his once empty mansion, filling rooms with flowers, music, and the scent of her cooking. Slowly, the cold fortress transformed into a home. The house that had echoed with loneliness now carried laughter, the healing sound of belonging. There were still challenges, of course. His world and hers did not blend without friction. At times, Harrison struggled with his instinct to control, to shield her from every harm, while Eleanor reminded him gently that love was not possession, but partnership. At times, Elena's insecurities returned, whispering that she was too small for the storms of his life, but Harrison silenced those doubts with steady devotion. Together, they learned that forever is not built in grand declarations, but in the daily choice to remain, to forgive, to begin again. One evening, under a sky painted with the colors of twilight, Harrison led her to the rooftop of his home. The city stretched out below them, glittering with lights, but he seemed to see only her. He held her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her skin, and for a long moment he struggled to find words. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low, almost reverent. "I have spent years conquering, building, fighting battles no one will ever know. But none of it has healed me the way your presence has. You've given me peace where there was once only noise. You've given me love where I thought only emptiness remained. I don't want this to be fleeting. I want it to be forever." Her heart tightened, her breath caught. And then, slowly, tears softened her eyes, not of sadness, but of recognition. She understood in that moment that their love was no longer fragile. It was a foundation. "You already have forever," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "It's here. It's in every step we take together. And no matter what comes, I will choose you again and again." He kissed her then, not with urgency, but with the tenderness of a man who had finally found home. It was a kiss that promised not perfection, but endurance, not escape, but sanctuary. A healing kiss, sealing the trials they had overcome and the future they would face together. In the months that followed, their bond became unshakable. The city learned to accept them, whispers fading into admiration for a love that had refused to bow to cynicism. The bookstore flourished with Harrison's quiet support, though Elena kept it as humble as always, a place where stories healed weary souls. And his empire, once cold and ruthless, began to reflect the man he was becoming, kinder, more compassionate, guided by the love that had transformed him. Together, they built not just a relationship, but a legacy of healing. Wherever they went, people felt it, the calm, the hope, the sense that love could still be pure, even in a world that often forgot its meaning. And so their story, once marked by doubt and trials, became a testament to the truth that love is not the absence of storms, but the courage to face them together. Eleanor and Harrison stood hand in hand at the threshold of forever, their hearts steady, their souls intertwined, knowing that the future, whatever it held, would always be something they faced as one. Because love, real love, is not about being unbroken. It is about healing together. If this story has touched your heart, if it has given you a moment of peace or reminded you of the healing power of love, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every word, every gesture of support helps us continue creating stories that bring light, warmth, and healing to those who need it most. And perhaps, just perhaps, your story of love is waiting to be told too.